We all have our favorite games, right? We all have games we look back on and we say, you know what, wow, that really stuck with me. It was something I really treasure. It was great. Now imagine, okay, for a second, that a game company that made this game came to you, took the game away, and said, well, sorry, we no longer support this, so you're not allowed to play it ever again. Even though you paid money for it, you can't have it now. It's gone. And then imagine, that company says, well, if you want to play it, we'll go ahead and let you play it, but you'll have to pre-order this game first, that no one wants. And they shove, crafting into it, for some goddamn reason. And the DLC, it gets re-released as well, and it's more expensive than it was the first time. And it doesn't make sense, and you're like, why are you doing this? Activision, you bitch! Some of you may have known, but most of you probably didn't because it wasn't very popular. There was a game called Lawbreakers. The initial release date was on August 8th, 2017. It was one of those newfangled online shooters people keep talking about. Unfortunately though, Lawbreakers is no longer playable. The company that owned the rights and the servers shut it down. And even if you poor lot paid money for access to use it, too bad, sport. Corporate America doesn't care. After injecting themselves into an already saturated market where online shooters are a horse apiece and literally no real marketing behind the game, it shut its servers down on the 14th of September 2018 because, believe it or not, the number of people playing was about as pathetic as Battleborn, which Gearbox is currently allowing to suffer on pity-induced life support. Just let it die, Randy. Randy! So Lawbreakers is closing down. Who cares? Well, I do, actually. Not because Lawbreakers was a good game or because it was unique or in some way worthy of my praise, but because what happened to Lawbreakers highlights an increasingly bad trend in the gaming industry. That bad trend being the failure of property owners to preserve or allow a third party to preserve content, especially content that cannot otherwise be preserved in a physical state. It's easy to go find an old NES or Genesis game that you played as a kid and take the ROM off the cart and preserve it on your own digitally. But most people don't know how to do that, and if no physical copies exist, then basically you're shit out of luck. If the game is a strictly online experience, then preservation is almost entirely impossible. Even more troubling are the tendencies of companies that own the IP and who will never use said IP again in the future, literally hunting people down and suing them for daring to preserve something that ought to be preserved. And it happened. Lawbreakers was shut down. It's just gone. Forever. A purely digital product that people paid money for is no more. No one who paid for it gets a refund either, mind you. It's tantamount to if Microsoft went out of business and deactivated all the copies of its operating system so you couldn't use it anymore. And that would be completely ridiculous. People would be in the streets. How on earth is that legal? How in the world is it legal for a company to take your money and then shut down the service you paid for? Most of the time, the justification for companies doing this shut down a game thing is buried in the end user license agreement. Companies for some reason seem to think that EULAs are legally binding documents that allow them to do whatever they want with the content you paid for, which they aren't. Companies always like to act like adding a EULA to the beginning of a game releases them from the liability of the consumer-seller relationship, which it doesn't, highlighting again the need for a rule or legislation that forces preservation of life for content that a consumer paid for. TLDR, if you paid for something, you should have access to it. If you paid for a video game, there should be a state of that video game that you can still play after a server is shut down. But companies ironically don't like consumers, oftentimes pressuring policymakers to implement anti-consumer policies. In this type of situation, I'm reminded of PT. I'm sure quite a few people remember the only good thing Konami has done in the last decade. A superbly impressive bit of advertising for a Silent Hill game that unfortunately will also never happen. A rich story told through a repeating hallway that led to new experiences each time the player traversed the area. Something that truly marvelous made a massive impact for video games through sheer conceptual brilliance. PT changed the way we look at and play horror games. And you literally can never play it again. And if you ever want to play it for yourself, you're just kinda fucked. It's even more insulting when you remember PT was a free product, and when someone dared recreate it, Konami shut him down. Why? What possible harm came to Konami in that instance? Were you losing money on a free product that teased a game that never happened? Yes, yes, yes. How dare we try to re-release something you didn't make a fucking dime off of, Konami, you pricks, you losers. But hey, at least Konami would like you all to remember that the people who still have it downloaded can still play it. Gee, thanks, Konami. It almost makes me forget you're a rat's nest in business suits. This isn't even a new problem. The gaming industry has never given a single fuck about preserving the content it makes. A beat-em-up game back in 1991 featuring The Simpsons is forever lost in time now. And unless you can find the original arcade cabinet, you won't be playing it ever again. City of Heroes, an online game themed around a world populated with superheroes and villains, was shut down in 2012. A game that had a dedicated following had to close up shop because of shoddy business within the company. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's just as true then as it is now. There is no urgency on the side of the AAA industry to archive any video game for historical purposes. No plan of action to continue the playability of games for the sake of their customers who paid for the service. In the world of video games, you aren't guaranteed an eternal product. One day, any game you enjoy can be ripped away from you by the people who own its intellectual property. A fear that is more compounded when you take into account the fervent push to put everything on the cloud and run services digitally, which is extra sad. Games are a digital product. One only needs to copy and paste it onto a new storage medium to preserve it forever. But on the flip side, if no one's making copies of it, then poof, it's gone. Digital products are both ripe for preservation and most at risk of destruction. But companies care more about intellectual property than they do about artistic appreciation or customer satisfaction. How many Call of Duty games no longer have playable online? Every new Call of Duty game means an older version is shut down. How about Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game? And this isn't just a few outlying examples. There are hundreds of games that people would still play were it not for companies throwing them into a safe somewhere never to see the light of day again. No one is allowed to buy these games ever again, and the only way to get your hands on it is through less than legal means. And I say, that's just fine. In this instance, I think piracy is just dandy. I can almost guarantee you that Ubisoft will not be reviving Scott Pilgrim vs. the World ever again. And if you ain't selling, my friend, what other choice do I have? I mean, cause Scott Pilgrim is an admittedly good game. Now, I'm not saying pirate every game you want, because most games can be purchased and don't require servers to maintain their playability. If the property holders aren't going to let me buy something, then fuck it, I'm gonna get a ROM of it. If I had the option to buy it, I would, but I don't, so ROM. And in this instance, how exactly is it wrong? Classic games usually aren't sold by game companies nowadays, and unless you want to go out and buy an old console and search high and low for a game cartridge, you can usually find yourself in a situation where you can't find the title you want. Even when you do find a cart you want, none of the money put towards buying said cart gets back to the publisher anyway. And honestly, why would I pay money for something when I could just get a copy of it online? I liked playing the Aliens arcade game at the mall when I was younger, but I sure as hell won't shell out thousands of dollars for an arcade cabinet when I could just download a ROM that cost me nothing. Especially since Konami will never release that game as a port, ever. No one gets hurt, I get to be happy, the world keeps spinning, who the fuck cares? Quite why game companies give two shits about classic games, or more ridiculous, games they legally can't sell anymore, is completely beyond me. The only explanation I can think of is its property holders clutching their pearls and a highly improbable chance they will one day make money off those titles again. And I, like many others, am not going to sit around waiting for a company or copyright holder to get their head out of their asses to make it happen. Now, if you don't mind, I have an emulation console I need to load ROMs onto because it literally hurts no one, and the video game companies can fuck off in this situation. Before we end this episode today, I would like to give a shout out to Emu Paradise, where I got a lot of my ROMs from. They were sued by Nintendo for having a lot of Nintendo ROMs. I guess I can kind of understand it from Nintendo's viewpoint, because a lot of those games are still being sold by Nintendo. But then again, Nintendo doesn't really care when it, I'm gonna say illegally, files false DMCA takedowns on YouTube videos that are clearly fair use. So fuck Nintendo in that regard. I think it kind of evens out. Yeah. Also, I shouldn't have to say this, but don't steal stuff, guys. A lot of games out there are abandonware anyway, and you can just get those for free. It's a shitty thing to do, okay? There are a lot of people who work in the industry who aren't part of the corporate structure, who just work for them, who put their heart and soul into these games, and they deserve the money. You know, just out of principle, just don't steal stuff, okay? It doesn't mean pirate everything, and it's just my opinion. I'm not saying follow it. So, yeah.